Right, good morning everyone. We are going to continue with the chapter on control and coordination. Okay, so here we are basically, we have in the previous slides discussed what is an axon and how a nerve cell looks like, what is a dendrite, what are the nerve endings, what is a myelin sheath, what is basically the nodes of Renwire. So these are things that we have already considered in the previous slides. Just one second. Okay, so we have already considered these things in the previous slides. Now we are going to consider how the information is basically transferred. Okay, so messages which the neurons transmit, the messages which are transmitted by the neuron are in the form of nerve impulses. These are basically messages which are in the form of nerve impulses. Okay, nerve impulses are transmitted. How? The dendrites basically pick up the nerve impulses from receptors. So there are certain receptors. Okay, so as we know that the cell body or the cyton, the dendrites basically are the web like thing that are there around the cell body or the cyton. So the dendrites are reaching the receptors. So we have different types of receptors, like the skin is a receptor. Okay, so the receptors, the dendrites pick up the nerve impulses from the receptors and they pass the impulses to the cell body. These receptors are passed in the form of electrical signals to the cell body and then along the axon. So these nerve impulses travel all along the axon. The axon passes the impulse or message to another neuron through a junction called synapse. Okay, so basically one axon, so here you have this one dendrite, this is one, and then again the other one, and this is again, so this is again the other one, this is again. Okay, this is how the series of nerve impulses will be. So this is basically the dendrite part. It collects the information from the dendrite, okay, passes on to the cell body, it travels all the way along the axon, the other nerve cell is connected here, then it passes to the other one, and so on and so forth. The junction of the nerve ending of the axon to the dendrite of the others is known as synapse. This junction is called a synapse. So this is how the basic nerve cell will look like. However, we have different forms. Like now these neurons which we are talking about, these neurons basically will be of three types. They are sensory, there are motor, and there are relay neurons. Now what are sensory neurons? These sensory neurons basically transmit impulses from the sensory cells, okay, which are basically receptors, okay, towards the central nervous system or the spinal cord or the brain. Okay, so sensory nerves, what they do? They transmit impulses from the sensory cells, receptors towards, so these are sensory cells which are receptors. Let's say our hands, the skin is a receptor. Okay, so this information is gathered and it is unidirectional. The signal passes from the receptor to the central nervous system. Basically, the central nervous system is made up of the spinal cord and the brain. Okay, now what are motor neurons? So once this information passes to the central nervous system, okay, the central nervous system decodes and knows what needs to be done. A decision is made and the message is transferred by electrical signals, that is through motor neurons, to the effector muscles, okay, that is the receptors. For example, let's say this board is super hot and by accident I touch it, so my hands will immediately withdraw. So what has happened in this effect? So this sense of hotness has been perceived by my skin, which is basically a receptor. Okay, now all these nerves which were there as sensory nerves, they perceive that this is a high temperature object and this will burn the skin if it is kept for a while. Okay, so immediately my hand is pulled off. Even if I don't see it, my hand is pulled off. Okay, so what has happened? The message has gone to the central nervous system, which can be the brain or the spinal cord as applicable. Okay, so when we are talking about our hands and legs, it is generally the spinal cord which takes the control. Okay, and in case of our cranial nerves, it is the brain which takes the control. So whichever ways, this passes to the central nervous system and immediately a decision is made and the message is sent to, let's say, the motor neurons. Now if my hands have to withdraw, okay, if my hands have to withdraw, then obviously the sense has to pass to the cells out here and this will pull off. Okay, so that's how the motor neurons works. And then we have the relay neurons which occur in CNS and which serve as links between other neurons. So the relay neurons are basically in the central nervous system, that is in the brain and the spinal cord, and they serve as links between other neurons. Okay, so you can take a snapshot of the same. Okay, so any two neurons in a nervous system, basically any two neurons in a nervous system, if we are considering a nervous system, any two neurons that are there in a nervous system do not join completely, and this is a little surprising. Okay, so the neurons basically are what? They are nerve cells, and they are placed one after the other. I'm sorry. So neurons are placed one after the other. So any two of the neurons will not join completely. Okay, let me give you an example here. So let's say this is basically a neuron, it's an axon, and is joined to the other one. Okay, this is joined to a third one, and so on and so forth. So these are basically, so dendrites are placed here. The dendrites are going to receive the information from the receptor, and the electrical impulses pass through the axon, and this is the synapse, basically the joining point. And however, if you look into this, that they are not joined completely. So we'll understand this with a diagram. Any two neurons in the nervous system do not join completely. There is always a very small gap between two neurons where they join. So these are two neurons, let's say. Okay, so this is the end part of an axon. Understand, the dendrites are somewhere here. They have collected the information in form of electrical impulses from a receptor, and these electrical impulses are passing through the axon, which is again insulated by a myelin sheath. Okay, we are just talking about how electrical impulses and how the synapse looks like. Okay, so the electrical impulses are passing through the axon. Okay, axon, sensory neuron. Okay, this passes. So let's say this is neuron A and neuron B, which are connected. This is the synapse. Okay, if you look into it, they are not absolutely joined together. Okay, they are not joined together. They are like this. Okay, and basically what happens is, a receptor is a sense organ which is in touch with the dendrites. So any receptor basically receives the signal, and it is in touch with the dendrites. So this passes on, okay, in touch with the dendrites of sensory neuron. So the receptor is in touch with the dendrites of the sensory neuron. Okay, synapse basically fills the gap between two connecting neurons. So what is the synapse? Synapse is a microscopic gap, a very thin gap, basically a microscopic gap between a pair of adjacent neurons. So these are one after the other neurons. So a synapse is basically a very thin gap between a pair of adjacent neurons over which nerve impulses pass. So over which nerve impulses pass when going from one neuron to the next. Okay, so these nerve impulses are passing when they are going from one neuron to the next. Okay, so synapse, in spite of being a gap, connects two neurons. So in spite of being a gap, it connects two neurons. How? Because there are some chemical things which are secreted here. Okay, now what happens is, see, a receptor, this is basically the electrical impulse which is carried here, and when it reaches here, there are certain chemical releases. Okay, there are certain chemical compounds which are released, and these chemical compounds get the electrical signals converted again. Okay, so understand this. So this is basically the first neuron. The dendrite part is here. So the dendrites are here. Now the dendrites basically, once they receive, they convert chemical impulses to electrical impulses. These electrical impulses are passing through the axon. They reach the synapse, which is basically the joining point of the two neurons. And again, synapse is not a perfect join. Still, what happens when it reaches the end point here, these electrical impulses generate a chemical fluid. Okay, so these electrical impulses basically generate a chemical fluid. So and this chemical fluid again generates electrical impulses, which passes on to the neuron B. Okay, so the synapse or the gap between two connecting neurons. This synapse is the gap between two connecting neurons. So receptor is a sense organ which is in touch with the dendrites of a sensory neuron. Okay, so that's how the synapse thing works. Synapse, in spite of being a gap, connects two neurons. So stimulus on receptor, basically stimulus is generated on the receptor, and there is a chemical reaction which is generated, and this chemical reaction basically generates a electrical impulse. Okay, so stimulus is generated on the receptor, and the dendrites receive this. Chemical reaction is originated. This chemical reaction generates the electrical impulse, and this electrical impulse gets carried forward. And again, synapse is just a one thing more which is very important. Synapse here is acting as a one-way valve. If you understand what a valve is, so let's say we have a pipe. Okay, in our buildings we have pipes. So the water always comes downwards. It never goes upwards. So the valve opens in such a way. Okay, in our heart also the valves open in such a way. So they are unidirectional valves. They do not go both ways. So synapse is basically a joint in which, so what will happen is, see, the electrical impulses are reaching here, the chemical substances are produced here. However, these chemicals are generated electrical impulses only in this direction. They will not generate electrical impulses in this direction, if you understand this. Okay, so in various pipings we have valves which ensure that the flow of the fluid or the liquid that is going through it is unidirectional. Okay, so here also it is unidirectional. The chemical substances which are generated in a synapse ensure that the electrical impulses pass on only in the direction towards the central nervous system. Receptors to central nervous system. Okay, receptors to central nervous system, it actually goes on to the relay neurons in the central nervous system. So this is a unidirectional flow. Okay, this is one-way valve, and synapse is also known as a one-way valve. The chemical substances present only on one side of the gap. So if you look into it, the chemical substances are present only on one side of the gap, not on the other side. Okay, so these chemical substances which generate the electrical impulses are present only on one side of the gap. So basically it's a conversion between chemical and electrical impulses. Chemical impulses get converted into electrical impulses, and again electrical impulses get converted into chemical impulses, so on and so forth in each of the synapses or each of the joints between two successive or adjacent neurons. Okay, so that's how the message finally reaches the central nervous system. So synapse, in spite of being a gap, connects two neurons. Okay, and this gap is necessary. What is the purpose of this gap we are going to study later, but synapse is one-way valve. Okay, I hope we have understood this. So stimulus on the receptor captured by chemical reactions. Chemical reactions generate electrical impulses, and these electrical impulses are passing from one nerve to the other. Okay, so you can take a snapshot of the same. All right, in continuation with the same chapter and the same topic. Okay, so we understood how a synapse or basically a joint is between two successive neurons. Okay, so why is this camera shaking? Why is it shaking? Okay, so we understood what is a synapse or basically a joint between two successive neurons, and now we are going to understand what is basically the entire cycle. Okay, so we have a receptor organ. Okay, this receptor basically receives the stimulus, and as soon as it receives the stimulus, a chemical reaction is set off. Okay, so when the receptor receives the stimulus or an external change which has suddenly happened in our environment, which might be favorable or which might be unfavorable, okay, to our body, so the stimulus can be either favorable or unfavorable as well. Okay, so for example, a lot of heat, almost a sudden heat, or anything which might be disturbing, or it can be the smell of a tasty food. So these are basically stimuluses. Okay, so the receptor receives the stimulus and a chemical reaction is set off in the receptor. This chemical reaction basically gets converted into electrical impulses. Okay, this chemical reaction basically gets converted into electrical impulses, and these electrical impulses basically are passing into the dendrite of a sensory neuron. Just one second. So these electrical impulses pass on to the dendrite of a sensory neuron. Okay, so from the receptor chemical impulses are generated. These chemical impulses get converted into electrical impulses, and these electrical impulses are passed on to the dendrite of a sensory neuron, which is the spider web thing. Okay, now from the dendrites it passes on to the cell body, which is also known as the cyton. Okay, this is basically the cyton, and from the cyton it actually passes on to the axon. Axon is basically the long tubular thing. Okay, so from the axon, now at the axon, as we have seen already, it ends in a terminal. So there is an axon terminal. At the terminal, what happens? The synapse or the electrical impulses. So the electrical impulses reach there and generate tiny amounts of a chemical substance. So as we saw it, so this is like this. It is coming through a pipe, the electrical impulses. Now at this junction, it is going to generate certain chemical substances, and these certain chemical substances will move in this direction. Okay, they are not going to move in this direction. Okay, so the next neuron, the chemical substances crosses the gap. It crosses the gap or the synapse and reaches the next neuron. It reaches the next neuron. Okay, the synapse, and this chemical substances generate electrical impulses, which are pretty much similar to the ones generated at the receptor. Okay, generates electrical impulses, and into this passes on to the dendrites of the second neuron, okay, and second neuron, and this cycle keeps on repeating, first neuron, second neuron, third neuron, and so on and so forth, till it reaches the relay neurons in the brain or the spinal cord. Now what are these relay neurons? They are going to make the decision and pass on the decision to the receptor, to the effector organs, okay. So the relay neurons are going to pass on the motor neurons. Relay neurons and motor neurons work in a similar fashion, okay. So the relay neurons and the motor neurons connect in a similar way to bring electrical impulses from the brain and the spinal cord to the effectors like muscles and glands. So these are basically the effectors like muscles and glands which are connected to the relay neurons. These relay neurons are basically bringing in the information to the muscles and the glands, okay, so that the effect might be implemented. So if the hand needs to be removed from a very hot object, it can be immediately removed, or maybe you are you have stepped on a pricky surface or a needle, so your feet needs to be removed. So these are immediate things that will automatically take place because these will pass on to the effectors. Now the effectors could be glands or the effectors could be muscles. For example, it reaches here the relay neuron transferred it to the effector. Now I need to remove my hand from a hot object which I have accidentally touched, so my effector organs are going to contract, another muscle is going to contract. So these electrical impulses will pass to the effector. So the effect will be the muscles will contract and my hand will be retarded, okay. My hand will be retarded from that surface which is hot, or withdrawn from the surface which is hot, and this happens within the fraction of a second, very quick, okay. So this is basically a muscular contraction which is generated in the effector organ. Muscles are basically the effector organs. The relay neurons passes on the information to the effector organs in the same way. In the same way means in the same electrical impulses, chemical impulses, then going through the synapse and on so on and so forth. So the process is almost the same. The process is going to be the same. So this is something that is happening every time, okay. So when it is going from the receptor to the spinal cord, it happens in the same way, and from the spinal cord to the effector organs, it goes in the same way, okay. So this is pretty much the same. Okay, so this process continues and till it reaches the motor neurons, and the motor neurons basically cause the effect. So the process of transference of electrical signals, the conversion from chemical signals to electrical signals, all happens in pretty much the same way, okay. How is the granular secretions there? So let's say if you have consumed a certain food which is very tasty, the taste is actually stored in your memory, a gulab jamun or maybe a samosa, some junk food which is very tasty. So once that taste is, or rather the smell of the food comes, automatically the saliva starts generating in your mouth, okay. We say in Hindi that muh mein pani aa gaya. So that saliva is basically generating in your mouth so that your body is getting ready to consume that food, okay. The process of digestion has actually started without even the food entering your system. That's how effective the nervous system is, okay. So there is a chemical impulse that is generated. This generates the muscles, okay. So from the spinal cord or from the relay neurons, it passes on to the glands which are secreting a particular secretion which is necessary for a particular process. So these are certain things which you need to keep in mind. You can take a snapshot of the same.